There's this one shot in The Fabelmans that I can't stop thinking about. Sammy sits watching his family during what is perhaps the movie's most distressful moment. He looks up to the mirror behind them, and then sees this reflection. I've been playing it over and over in my mind, trying to untangle what it means, and trying to figure out why it was this moment in particular that popped into my mind one Monday evening about a year ago, as I was sitting in the emergency room, where my fiancée was struggling for her life. We thought it was food poisoning at first, and initially got sent home with that same diagnosis when we checked in with the doctor on Sunday. But after a sleepless night and another day of severe abdomen pain, we drove back up to the hospital. An unfortunately busy day, hours of waiting, multiple doctors coming in and out. They could tell something was wrong, but weren't sure what exactly. They admitted her in the late evening. She was already barely conscious at this point.
They tell me you want to be a picture maker.
Yes, sir, I do.
Why? This business, it'll rip you apart.
As a semi-autobiographical work, The Fabelmans had this interesting side effect where it retroactively changed your entire perspective on Steven Spielberg's past filmography. Literally so even, as it ended on that note with Sammy who, after having struggled with his passion for filmmaking for many, many years, was now ready to receive the secret to the art form from one of the greatest living filmmakers at the time, which apparently is just a matter of placing the horizon at either the top or the bottom of the image, never in the middle.
When the horizon's at the bottom, it's interesting. When the horizon's at the top, it's interesting. When the horizon's in the middle, it's boring as shit.
Looking back now, it's strange how it at once feels like a giant blur, yet also crystal clear, which is actually not too different from how it felt at the time. A weirdly lucid haze of life in chaos. I remember our house, unnaturally empty without her presence. I remember all the time spent driving to the hospital, twice a day for what would eventually amount to about a week. 3 visiting hours in the morning, ending at lunchtime, and then 4 more in the late afternoon and early evening. During it all, I couldn't bring myself to do any work, no writing, no editing, but at the same time, I also couldn't stop my brain from dumbly going on as if I was thinking about books, movies, that ending to The Fabelmans. It's quite remarkable how you could go back through Spielberg's previous work, draw that imaginary line across his shots, and find it at either the top or the bottom. It's a fun exercise that gives you some nice insights into the art of composition. But I also couldn't shake the feeling there was a lot more going on here too. For with The Fabelmans, Spielberg not only joined the ranks of Malick, Tarkovsky, Kurosawa, Fellini and many other great filmmakers who eventually turned their camera inwards, but it felt like he also gave us a more general treatise on the fundamental problem that they were responding to. The fundamental problem that any serious filmmaker is, in some way, responding to. For as the Lord of the Rings author Tolkien once said, there's only one real conflict that can be found at the heart of every story, or at least every story that ever truly mattered to us.
Stories, practically always, a human story is practically always about one thing, aren't they? Death. The inevitability of death.
He points to a quote from Simone de Beauvoir that, to him, explained it most succinctly.
There is no such thing as a natural death. Nothing that happens to man is ever natural, since his presence calls the whole world into question. All men must die, but for every man his death is an accident, and even if he knows it and consents to it, an unjustifiable violation.
In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker went even further by proposing that the idea of death, the fear of it, is in fact the mainspring of all human activity. That pretty much everything we do is in some way driven by the instinctive urge to resolve the problem of death.
We're all hurtling towards death, yet here we are for the moment, alive. Each of us knowing we're going to die. Each of us secretly believing we won't.
I found I would often try to distract myself with other stuff, grasping for random insignificant things to occupy my mind, like figuring out my favorite route to the hospital. The quickest way was just to take the state highway north and then hop onto the freeway heading east. However, the state road was often quite busy, and worst of all, it has a bunch of roundabouts, which I don't have a problem with in principle, but when you encounter like 5 of them in quick succession and have to go back and forth over them twice a day, they can get a bit annoying. And so on most days I ended up not taking the roundabout route, as it had come to be known in my head. Instead, I went straight northeast and took what I called the country road, which really was just a grid structure of smaller roads zigzagging through the countryside. It was only a couple of minutes longer than the roundabout route, but much quieter and much more beautiful. There's some protected wetlands there, animals grazing in the fields, lots of birds flying over, and I don't know, it's just kind of weird when you really think about it. The place that death occupies in our everyday life. No one really denies death in a literal sense, like I understand it's a part of life. I accept conceptually the idea that someday I will die. But always someday, in some vague abstract point in the future. Not now, never now. Becker wrote that the sort of hidden reason why soldiers storm into point-blank fire during wars is because in their heart of hearts, they never believe they will be the one who will take the fatal bullet. They're only prepared to feel sorry for those next to them that do.
Your cancer is the result of incredible...
It does feel like there's this giant gap between the idea of death in general and the idea of death happening specifically to me. There's no shortage of stories about unexpected deaths or fatal accidents. And yet, while they might inspire a brief moment of pause in which I contemplate my own mortality, the truth is that as I go about my day-to-day existence, I don't really think about it at all. Some risks are neutered through rationalizations, as misguided as they can be, like, I'm a careful driver, I'm not gonna be in a car crash. I know some people died on this mountain hike, but I'm cautious, that's not gonna happen to me. Most often though, the reality of death, or the potential of it in an immediate sense, is just ignored altogether. The plane that crashes is never the one you just boarded, right? That story of that healthy person of your age who just developed cancer or got hit by a brain aneurysm or some other fatal affliction is tragic, but that's not gonna be yours. I mean, we know it can be, we tell ourselves it can happen, but do we ever truly believe it? Ever truly consider it as a real possibility that might happen specifically to us? There's an indicator to measure a body's infection rate that generally should be between 0 and 5. On Tuesday morning, after one night in the hospital, hers had risen to well over 400. As I stood there watching the hospital staff rush her into surgery, I felt stressed, but also kind of relieved. At least now they were gonna find what was wrong and fix it. I had real hope that everything would be fine, had real trust that the surgeon would find the issue and resolve it without complications. People around me had always praised me for being the eternal optimist, for always choosing to believe in the best possible outcomes. But in all honesty, I just never truly considered the possibility that something could have gone seriously wrong. Never truly considered the possibility that she could have died. And I don't think that's the same as optimism.
He's trying to get some kind of control over it.
Reaching back in search for the point of inception, we find that we are much more troubled about death, and from a much earlier age than most people realize. At first, tiny, helpless creatures, brought to life in a time that won't be remembered, and in a place that can't yet fully be perceived. But slowly our world expands, our awareness grows, we develop from something into someone. Building on Becker's work, the authors of The Worm at the Core observed how we first come to understand the world, or the scheme of things, as they refer to it, in social terms, in terms of good and bad, through direct and indirect signals from our parents, teachers, the people around us. We come to learn what is desired and what is not. Being nice and paying attention in school is good, breaking things and throwing tantrums is bad.
No.
the framework allows us to relax, as it provides us with security and significance, and helps to manage our fears. For the awareness of ourselves also gives rise to a seemingly innate sense of distress as we come to understand our own smallness and vulnerabilities. We grow to fear the dark, the unknown, the monsters under our bed. We become wary of strangers, big dogs. Around age 3 then, we begin to understand the impermanence of some things, living things, a dead animal by the wayside, a deceased grandparent, a child claimed by an accident. One way or another, the knowledge of death comes into being, and our simple world of good and bad, our simple world where social norms would provide us with safety, will never be the same again.
Will you die too?
Soon after children become aware of death, Solomon et al. Write, it dawns on them that they could die too. As they ponder their own existence, they begin to realize that they could also not exist. They become little hamlets as, over time, specific childhood fears coalesce into a general fear of no longer existing.
You think when you reach a certain age, things will start making sense. And you find out you're just as lost as you were before. I suppose that's what damnation is. The pieces of your life, never to come together.
According to Becker, the reason why the knowledge of death and the subsequent fear of non-existence is such a fundamental problem for us is because it sits at the very crux of the irresolvable paradox that is our being. On the one hand, a creature capable of contemplating its own existence and ultimate fate, capable of symbolically transcending its physical limitations to reach across time and space, while at the same time still being hopelessly bound to them, still being trapped in that fleshy casing that will someday decay, die, and disappear forever. Look at man, the impossible creature, Becker exclaimed. Though it's been many years since I first encountered his work, I still find it hard to quote him without getting lost in the poetry of his writing. I mean, just listen to this extended passage. Look at man, the impossible creature. Here, nature seems to have thrown caution to the winds along with the programmed instincts. She created an animal who has no defense against full perception of the external world. An animal completely open to experience, not only in front of his nose in his Umwelt, but in many Umwelten. He can relate not only to animals in his own species, but in some ways to all other species. He can contemplate not only what is edible for him, but everything that grows. He not only lives in this moment, but expands his inner self to yesterday, his curiosity to centuries ago, his fears to 5 billion years from now when the sun will cool, his hopes to an eternity from now. He not only lives on a tiny territory, nor even on an entire planet, but in a galaxy, in a universe, and in dimensions beyond visible universes. It is appalling, the burden that man bears, the experiential burden. Man can't even take his own body for granted as can other animals. It's not just hind feet, a tail that he drags, that are just there. Limbs to be used and taken for granted or chewed off when caught in a trap and when they give pain and prevent movement. Man's body is a problem to him that has to be explained. Not only his body is strange, but also its inner landscape, the memories and dreams. Man's very insides, his self, are foreign to him. He doesn't know who he is, why he was born, what he is doing on the planet, what he is supposed to do, what he can expect. His own existence is incomprehensible to him, a miracle just like the rest of creation, closer to him, right near his pounding heart, but for that reason all the more strange. Each thing is a problem, and man can shut out nothing. As Maslow has well said, it is precisely the godlike in ourselves that we are ambivalent about, fascinated by and fearful of, motivated to and defensive against. This is one aspect of the basic human predicament, that we are simultaneously worms and gods.
Look, everybody knows there's something wrong with them. They just don't know what it is. Everybody wants confession. Everybody wants some cathartic narrative for it.
Driving home in the days following her surgery, I often found myself not taking either the roundabout route or the country road. Instead, I drove the long way home, connecting through another city in the southeast. At first I wasn't sure why I drove this way. It wasn't particularly beautiful, and though it wasn't as bad as the roundabout route, it did still have 3 of them. But the thing was, as I later realized, that when I drove away from the hospital, taking the roundabout route meant taking an exit to the right to get on the freeway, and taking the country road meant taking an exit to the left to go into the countryside. But to take the long road home, I just had to go straight. I could just mindlessly drive forward. And at that point, that's pretty much all I wanted to do. I didn't want to think about what happened, what could have happened, what was going to happen. If not soon, then someday eventually. Every time I went up to visit her, walking through those long hospital hallways, I would pass the rooms of other patients and just couldn't help but catch glimpses of the multitude of other stories of hardship and suffering that were taking place there. And I hated it. Not so much because I felt sorry for them. I mean I did, but the real nature of my aversion was more selfish than that. Honestly, it scared me, being so viscerally reminded of the vulnerability, the pain, the general frailty of human life. Especially in the ones where you just know that they came into the hospital never to leave it again. The elderly suffering from their final pneumonia. The terminally ill whose last resort treatment yielded no results. The idea of that slow breakdown, of your body becoming a constant problem, aching, struggling, just a perpetual source of anguish, tearing away at your will, your dignity, exposing you in some way for what you really are.
I think human consciousness was a tragic misstep in evolution. We became too self-aware. We are things that labor under the illusion of having a self. This accretion of sensory experience and feeling, programmed with total assurance that we are each somebody, when in fact everybody's nobody.
I think it was the show True Detective that led me to Becker's work in the first place. There was of course Rust Cohle as the explicit voice of death awareness, but his partner, Marty Hart, was equally insightful as the stand-in for how, being faced with the crushing terror of our impossible predicament, we reflexively shrink away, partially detach ourselves from the full experience of reality, and retreat into psychological and social defense mechanisms that allow us to go about our lives without being constantly overwhelmed.
I was all right, and I was steady.
In psychoanalytical terms, as Becker explained, the act is known as transference, the way we latch onto social structures that simultaneously limit our experiential burden while also symbolically extending our lives beyond our death. The religious believer is not just promised an afterlife, but also a guide on how to live in this one. The soldier too is given brotherhood, discipline, and purpose upon his enlisting, and when he dies on the battlefield, his sacrifice is absorbed into the nation that will live on after him. And parents do not just become parents because raising children is a fulfilling life task, but also in some secret small part, so they have someone there on their deathbed to affirm one last time that all is well, that their lives mattered and that they will be remembered. Who knows, maybe this has been the real key to humanity's survival, new generations constantly being brought into existence to alleviate the old one's fear of dying alone and without meaning. Basically, it's a will towards heroism, the adoption of a framework that renders our lives and our actions meaningful and extends them beyond ourselves. And the point is that we all have our own personal immortality projects like this. We all seek external validation, and we all end up conforming ourselves to some social construct outside of ourselves. A culture, a leader, a job or a cause, a philosophy or ideology, some set of norms and values, some guiding principles that let us believe that we are more than food for worms, that we are someone in particular, someone who matters. In simple terms, we make our existence bearable by manufacturing an identity for ourselves, by filtering it through a self-constructed ego. This is the true denial of death, not a literal denial of our eventual non-existence, but a reduction of what it signifies about our fate, and about what this says about what we really are. Our private and collective delusions, human character as the vital lie, as Becker described it.
This is what I'm talking about. This is what I mean when I'm talking about time and death and futility. To realize that all your life, not all your love, all your hate, all your memory, all your pain, it was all the same thing. It was all the same dream, a dream that you had inside a locked room. A dream about being a person.
They say time heals all wounds, but there's a dilation here that is often neglected, for the world often moves on much quicker than the one who actually got injured. To her, this was probably the hardest part, sensing how, over time, those around her slowly went back to business as usual, and the heightened concern and involvement slowly faded away, as if once you get to the point where everything again feels similar enough to how it was before, you can just pretend the whole thing never even happened at all, act as if it meant nothing. But surely it had to have had some significance, if not in that it was meant to happen kind of way, as if it had been written in the stars, then in that I'll make it meaningful myself kind of way, treating it as a wake-up call. But a wake-up call for what exactly? She had what is known as an ileus. Basically it means her intestines got twisted up. You know, they're constantly moving around and that can happen sometimes. Normally this will resolve on its own, but in the rare case where it doesn't, your bowel can get obstructed, it stops working, tissue starts dying off, and eventually your entire system will shut down. By the time they opened her up, a part of her intestine had already turned pitch black. Luckily they got it just in time before it started leaking into the rest of her stomach, but still, it was pretty much a random event, an almost fatal dose of bad luck, and it's just hard to derive any meaning from that. The general problem with death denial, with us latching onto our various immortality projects, is that it works until it doesn't. We form an identity, a worldview, an understanding of how things ought to be, and it gives us security, guidance, and purpose. But then something will happen, as it inevitably always does, that upsets all of that. That opens back up that which we had so neatly confined, and reminds us that our protective shell was never all-encompassing, that we are still exposed to the void underneath. The void that engulfs the religious believer as a crisis of faith, makes him question if he's just praying into silence, and awaiting not heaven or hell, but plain nothingness upon his death. The void that undermines the soldier's trust in his mission, in his country, turning him into a lamb for the slaughter, a pawn in a game that was never really about honor or freedom or anything worth fighting for, and transforming his grand sacrifice into a life wasted for nothing. It's the void that can swallow anyone at any time, trap them into an existential crisis that suddenly makes any answer to life feel like a joke, an insult almost.
Pretending everything was okay, when it wasn't.
I'd never been satisfied with the common platitudes about gracefully accepting our mortality to begin with, but especially after seeing her suffer like that, after imagining just how easily, how randomly, she could have been ripped out of existence. All those attempts to somehow explain that away, to fold the paradox of our being into some simplified transcendental vision, felt more unserious than ever. As if we can magically erase our fears by pretending the awareness of death is actually some beautiful revelation instead of the premise we've been struggling with from the very beginning. Or that living in the full truth of our impermanence is actually some carpe diem type motivator, instead of our deepest source of existential terror. Like I wouldn't be scared shitless and cursing the universe if I develop cancer next year. Like I'm not shivering now even at the thought of it. No, I don't believe we can solve the problem of death through clever spins or rationalizations without simply falling back into new forms of denial, new forms of pretense that distract ourselves from how, when it comes down to it, everything we imagine ourselves to be, all our hopes, convictions and characteristics, all our perceived uniqueness, inner richness and complexity, is only temporarily allowed to exist because of a biological mass that can malfunction at any time.
You yourself This whole big drama, it was never anything but a jerry-rig of presumption and dumb will. And you could just let go.
I guess that's an option too. Just let go. Disengage. As Becker also pointed out, when society fails to provide us with the constructs that offer us some resolution or control, it will instead contrive to help us forget. And indeed, today it sure seems easier than ever to drink, drug, shop, binge or scroll our troubles away, to bury our existential dread in endless distractions, passively embracing that supposedly cold harsh truth about the human condition, or actively so even, becoming that passionate pessimist, fully submitting to our cosmic insignificance, and rejecting our ego and all it aspires to as if the whole of human experience is but the meaningless noise made by an animal destined to die, an animal born out of a tragic evolutionary misstep.
I think the honorable thing for our species to do is deny our programming, walk hand in hand into extinction.
But the problem here is that all this felt like just as much of a pretension as living in full death denial. How can we say that evolution has made a mistake with man? Becker argued. That the development of the forebrain, the power to symbolize, to delay experience, to bind time, was not intended by nature and so represents a self-defeat embodied in an impossible animal. Because, as he then proposed, is it not these exact qualities, embodied within our consciousness, our ego, that represent an immense broadening of the meaning of our being, that signify a step into a true kind of sub-divinity in nature, as he put it? Life in the body is not all we have if we have an ego, and the ego represents, as far as we can judge, a natural urge by the life force itself towards an expansion of experience, toward more life. If the urge toward more life is an evolutionary blunder, then we are calling into question all of creation and fitting it into the narrow mold of our own preferences about what more life ought to be. In other words, minimizing ourselves to a mere body capable only of self-delusion and dying is just another form of arrogance, another reductive rationalization that diminishes the full scope, the full weight of human existence by trying to encapsulate it into a neatly defined and sensible construct. And most of all, it ignores that which we know to be true emotionally, instinctively, that which I knew to be true as I grabbed her hand in that split second before they moved her into surgery, and as I later felt in all those fleeting moments of true gratitude for what was saved and in those brief instances of real anxiety for what could have been lost. That I don't want to let go, that I don't even want to think about letting go, that I don't want to forget, don't want to go numb, don't want to feel trapped in that mirror reflection of my own world, experiencing it as a detached observer. No, I want to feel it from the consciousness at its center. I want to live, I have to live, as if our existence matters. This is what Cohle too realizes at the end when he touches something outside of his capacity for understanding. Not the void, but something else, something within him or beneath him. That human spirit or life force, as Becker seems to call it, which so inexplicably yet so fervently struggles for its own being, and which therefore so frustratingly sends us right back to the same paradox we started with, to us trying to get some grip on our lives and on ourselves.
It's feeling like life has slipped through your fingers.
All those years.
My life is just going by so fast, but it's not getting anywhere.
Living the life of someone.
Like the future's behind you, like
I didn't even know.
Like it's always been behind you.
How do I begin?
Maybe that's the real problem. That deep down we know there is no definitive answer, no way out from the terrible conundrum we are born into. But then again, maybe there shouldn't be.
Courage is the solution to despair. Reason provides no answers.
When talking about art, Andrei Tarkovsky once argued that the artist only exists precisely because the world is not perfect. For if it was, as he put it, man wouldn't look for harmony but would simply live in it. Art is born out of an ill-designed world. And maybe that's true for our general sense of humanity as well. maybe there needs to be some pressure on it to fully bring it about. This, in the end, seems to be Becker's sort of anti-answer to the paradox of our being, that while we should acknowledge it, perhaps we shouldn't try to resolve it. I think that taking life seriously means something such as this, he concluded, that whatever man does on this planet has to be done in the lived truth of the terror of creation, of the grotesque, of the rumble of panic underneath everything. Otherwise, it is false. But at the same time, as he continued, it is from within that truth that we must still orient our consciousness beyond ourselves, beyond that terror of death, and therefore have some degree of healthy repression so that we can create and move toward new heroisms, toward new ideals of self-transcendence. Essentially, he's saying that we have to live inside a contradiction, which is something that demands of us not exactly a leap of faith, but a certain embrace of the irrational. Why? Because we simply don't know the purpose of creation, and therefore cannot fully understand ourselves. We only feel that life force straining within us, instinctively pushing us in the direction of its own expansion, its own apparent longing for purpose and meaningfulness. There is a driving force behind the mystery that we cannot understand, Becker said, and it includes more than reason alone. The urge to cosmic heroism, then, is sacred and mysterious and not to be neatly ordered and rationalized. In other words, we can't live in perfect symmetry. For better and worse, our horizon sits at the top or at the bottom, but never in the middle.
Wisdom is holding two contradictory truths in our mind simultaneously. Hope and despair. A life without despair is a life without hope. Holding these two ideas in our head is life itself.
Last January, we finally went on our honeymoon to New Zealand, where despite her having been severely malnourished and in a wheelchair just a few months back, she was again strong enough to challenge its highest mountains. I walked behind her as we crossed fields and rivers and began making our way upwards. Ascending out of the forest, we got high enough to see the entire valley below us, high enough to peer over the mountaintops where we saw more mountains, endless mountains, emerging in rapturous beauty to the far end of the horizon. We got high enough to see the whole of the country, its mighty volcanoes, thunderous waterfalls, the waves crashing on the rocky coastline, high enough to see the Shire with its little hobbit houses, and those vast plains where they filmed the lands of Rohan and where we camped out under a setting sun and life felt magical in that way in which it only very rarely does. We got high enough to see all the way back to the other side of the world, see our house and the hospital and the whole of our lives and everything that ever was and ever will be, stretching out into infinity. There's one last thing I want to address which some of you might be concerned about, and that's the financial picture of this whole story. Luckily, my wife and I are fortunate to live in a country with a decent healthcare system, a full week in the hospital including surgery, meals and round-the-clock care and attention. Only set us back our yearly deductibles and about 40 euros in parking fees, which in the grand scheme of things is pretty much negligible. And so instead, I want to use this opportunity to bring your attention to a greater cause that's very dear to our heart and that I believe actually forms a solid response to Becker's call for new heroisms. As you have probably guessed by now, we love being out in nature. For my wife, it's quite literally been a healing experience to be able to take in all those sights and sounds again, all that beauty. It's just so reinvigorating in ways that is difficult to properly articulate, which is all the more reason not to take these places for granted, and why I'd love to share with you an amazing community-funded organization that protects biodiversity around the globe, the Nature Conservation Project Planet Wild. Through a global community of nature enthusiasts who care deeply about the natural world and its wildlife, Planet Wild is engaged in a wide variety of conservation projects. Every month they select a new project partner to protect animals, forests and oceans, and each mission is documented and can be viewed on their YouTube channel, which is not just a great way to follow what they're up to, but which is also genuinely inspiring as it demonstrates how simple local initiatives can make such a huge difference and literally revive entire landscapes into thriving ecosystems. Such as this mission where they are reintroducing the iconic wildlife that once defined the American Plains, which used to be described as the American Serengeti, an area nearly the size of Texas and California combined, and which I'm really hoping to visit someday as the American bison is one of my favorite animals. Anyways, these videos are also a great way to see how much of an impact you could be making. For every Planet Wild mission is funded through memberships. It's basically crowdfunding for nature, which I think is pretty cool. I'm already a member myself, and if you too like to support their efforts and, engage yourself in an immortality project that is actually doing something meaningful, you can become a member right now through a monthly contribution of your own choosing. Big or small, whatever feels right. And if you do so through my personal link or by using the code STORIES10, then I'll make sure that the first 150 people to sign up will get their first month paid for by me. So again, if you want to become part of a global conservative community dedicated to preserving nature and making the world a better place, head on over to Planet Wild and be sure to use my personal link or just scan this QR code to immediately start making a difference for ourselves and for the future.